The laughter wasn't loud, but it had the sharpness of a serrated blade, cutting through the heavy mahogany doors of the library and straight into Eliza Drago's heart. She stood in the dim, marble-floored hallway of the sprawling estate, holding a tray of honeyed tea she had prepared for the man she thought was her sanctuary. Outside, the pre-dawn mist of the valley clung to the windows like a shroud, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the casual cruelty of men who owned the world. "She's like a stray pup, honestly," came the voice, deep, smooth, and devastatingly familiar. It belonged to Julian Corleone, first name from Madagascar, last name from The Godfather, the man who held the city's docklands in his iron grip and Eliza's heart in his callous hand. "You should see the way she follows me with those wide, trusting eyes. I barely have to say a word and she's already anticipating my next command. It's almost pathetic how easily some people can be bought with a few kind words and a roof over their head." A roar of mocking laughter followed from his associates, but Eliza didn't stay to hear the rest. The silver tray trembled in her grip before she set it silently on a velvet bench. Every "I love you" he had whispered in the dark, every soft touch on her cheek, every promise of a future where she finally belonged, it was all a game. A joke told over brandy to impress men who valued nothing but power. The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't storm into the room to demand an apology he wasn't capable of giving. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over her. She looked down at the silk gown he had bought her, the diamond pendant glittering at her throat, the gilded chains of her humiliation. She turned and walked toward the servants' entrance. She took nothing. No clothes, no jewels, not even a pair of sturdy shoes. She walked out into the freezing gray light of the coming dawn with only the clothes on her back and the shredded remains of her dignity. By the time Julian Corleone looked for his stray pup to fetch his morning paper, the only thing left of Eliza Drago would be the echoes of a devotion he had traded for a laugh. Hello, my wonderful viewers. I am so incredibly grateful to have you back at the channel today. Whether you're watching from the quiet countryside of England, the vibrant heart of Lagos, or a cozy apartment in New York City, welcome to the circle. How is everyone doing today? I hope you're ready for an emotional roller coaster that proves sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is absolutely nothing at all. If you haven't already, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our community of story lovers. It's your support that allows me to keep creating these 40-minute journeys of the heart. Are you subscribed? So, drop a comment below letting me know where in the world you're watching from. Now, as Eliza steps into the cold morning mist, leaving everything behind, Julian is about to learn that you never know the value of a woman's silence until it's the only thing she leaves you. The gravel of the driveway bit into Eliza's thin evening slippers, but she didn't feel the pain. Her mind was already miles away, navigating the city streets she had once called home before Julian had rescued her from the weaving district. He had promised her a life of influence and wealth, but all he had given her was a front-row seat to her own worthlessness. She reached the iron gates of the estate, the massive Corleone crest staring down at her like a predator. The guard didn't even look up as she slipped through the side pedestrian gate. To the men of this world, she was as invisible as the air. As she hit the main road, the first sliver of the sun broke over the horizon, a jagged line of orange light that felt less like a new day and more like a funeral for the woman she used to be. She had no money, no plan, and no one to turn to. Julian had made sure of that, subtly isolating her from her friends until his world was the only world she knew. "Where to, miss?" a gravelly voice asked. Eliza startled, realizing she had walked all the way to the outskirts of the harbor. An old fisherman was loading crates into a weathered truck. He looked at her silk dress, now stained with mud and dew, and the hollow expression in her eyes. "Away," Eliza whispered, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Just away." The man grunted, seeing a story he had seen 1,000 times in a city built on the broken hearts of the innocent. "I'm heading to the northern coast. It's a long haul. No luxury there, just salt and work." "Perfect," Eliza said, stepping toward the truck. She reached up and unclipped the diamond pendant from her neck, the last tie to the man who had laughed at her soul. She handed it to the fisherman. "Take this. It's worth more than your truck and the house you live in. Just get me out of this city before he wakes up." The fisherman stared at the gem, then at the girl who was discarding a fortune as if it were trash. He nodded slowly and opened the door. The truck rattled like a dying engine as it put miles between Eliza and the estate. Eliza Drago sat in the passenger seat, staring through the grimy glass at the passing blur of suburban walls and gated driveways, the perimeter of the world Julian controlled. 4 months she had been Julian Corleone's ornament, his bird in a gilded cage, as he often called her when he wanted to sound poetic before a glass of scotch. Eliza was the daughter of Elias Drago, the name of the weary, resilient father from the last of the Mohicans, a man who had taught her that a thread, no matter how thin, could hold an entire fabric together if it was strong enough. She had believed that strength was about endurance, about bending without breaking. But as the miles increased, she realized the truth. The strongest thing a person could do was to stop being the thread that bound someone else's life together when they didn't even notice you were there. Her deepest fear wasn't poverty or the cold, bitter winds of the northern coast. It was the hollow, numbing realization that she had almost traded her entire identity to be the shadow of a man who didn't respect her. Meanwhile, back at the estate, the silence was, as always, absolute. Julian Corleone descended the grand staircase with a faint, satisfied hum on his lips. It was Tuesday, his favorite day, the day his business associates from the city came to discuss the expansion of the docks. He enjoyed showing off his home, and more importantly, he enjoyed showing off Eliza. She was the perfect accessory, quiet, elegant, and perpetually grateful. He walked into the breakfast room expecting to see her at the small marble table where she usually waited, her hands folded in her lap. The table was empty. "Eliza," he called out, his voice echoing in the vaulted ceiling. He glanced at the clock. It was 8 a.m. She was never late. She was, quite frankly, never anything that wasn't exactly what he wanted her to be. He wandered into the kitchen, then the library. The house felt strangely cold, an architectural shell that suddenly felt cavernous. He checked the master bedroom. Her closet was open, the racks of designer silks and furs still hanging there, untouched. "She's probably in the gardens," he muttered to himself, but a strange, prickly sensation began to crawl up the back of his neck. He stepped out onto the terrace. The air was crisp and the sun was fully up now, casting long, accusing shadows across the lawn. He saw the gardener, a man named Gabe Heston, first name from The Office, last name from The Last Samurai, trimming the hedges. "Gabe," Julian barked, his voice losing its usual lazy confidence. "Where is Miss Drago?" Gabe paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Haven't seen her, sir. I saw the gate light blink open around dawn, but I figured it was just the delivery truck coming in early." Julian's chest tightened. He went back inside, his pace accelerating until he was striding through the halls, checking rooms he had ignored for months. He finally stopped in the dressing room. He looked at her vanity. It was impeccably clean, just as it had always been. But there, resting on the velvet tray where she kept her jewelry, was the single plain gold band he had given her. Not an engagement ring, but a promise that she was his. He picked it up, expecting it to feel cold. It felt heavy. He didn't panic, at least not yet. He told himself she had just gone for a walk, that the stray had simply wandered too far. But as the hours stretched into the afternoon, and then into the evening, the house began to scream at him. He realized with a jarring, sickening thud that he didn't know her friends, he didn't know her favorite places, and he didn't even know what she did for fun. He had spent months dissecting her life to see how it fit into his, and yet he knew nothing about her at all. "Find her," he told his security chief, his voice strained. "She can't have gone far. She has nothing. No money, no car, no family." He walked to the window and looked out at the vast, uncaring landscape. For the first time in his life, the power, the wealth, and the influence he wielded felt like ash. He had mocked her loyalty to his friends, bragging about her predictable nature, but now, in the quiet of his grand house, the sound of his own laughter from the previous night replayed in his head like a death knell. He realized then that he wasn't just looking for his ornament. He was looking for the only person who had ever looked at him, not at his bank account or his title, but at the man he had once been before the cruelty had taken root. We're starting to see the cracks in Julian's cold, calculated world. It's a powerful moment when a person realizes that they've lost someone they didn't even realize they loved. Are you team, let her go, or he needs to fight for her? Let me know in the comments below. And hey, if you're enjoying the suspense and the emotional growth of our characters, make sure you're subscribed. We are just getting started on this journey of regret and redemption. Don't miss the next part. The inciting incident of his search is about to blow the lid off everything. As the sun set, casting the room into a deep, bruising purple, Julian sat in the library, the very place where he had laughed at her. He stared at the empty chair where she had always sat, waiting for him. "You really didn't take anything," he whispered to the empty air, a tremor in his hand that he couldn't control. He didn't know it yet, but the woman he had dismissed as a stray was already miles away, trading her silk for a coarse wool coat and her vulnerability for the hard, unyielding steel of a survivor. The game was over, and for the first time Julian Corleone was terrified. The morning after the disappearance was not a morning at all. It was a cold, gray awakening for the Corleone empire. Julian Corleone stood in his study, the room smelling of stale brandy and the sharp metallic scent of a man who had not slept. His security chief, a man named Gus Beckett, first name from Breaking Bad, last name from Pirates of the Caribbean, stood at attention, his tablet displaying a map of the city that was now a web of failed investigations. "She's a ghost, boss," Gus said, his voice flat. "No card activity. No travel records. The traffic cameras at the estate were looped. She must have known exactly how to avoid the lens. It's like she vanished into the atmosphere." Julian smashed his glass against the fireplace, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She's a weaver's daughter from the docks, Gus. She doesn't have the resources to disappear. Start tearing the city apart. If she's in a hotel, if she's on a bus, I want to know." "Sir," Gus hesitated, "there's one more thing. The pawn shop in the Harbor District. They reported a high-end diamond pendant coming in late last night. Sold by an elderly fisherman." Julian's breath hitched. He snatched the tablet, pulling up the image of the pendant, the one he had given her on their 6-month anniversary. He had told her it was a token of affection, but in reality, it was just a purchase to keep her quiet. Now, looking at it through a grainy digital lens, it looked like a betrayal. She hadn't kept his gifts. She hadn't even tried to pawn them for a head start on a new life. She had essentially discarded them to pay for a ticket to nowhere. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a woman. He had lost his leverage. "She's heading north," Julian whispered, his mind racing. He looked at the map, tracing the route to the rugged coastline where the only thing waiting was freezing water and hard labor. He didn't wait for his guards. He grabbed his coat and headed for his private car, his heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythm that felt suspiciously like terror. He needed to find her. Not to bring her back to the estate, he told himself, but to understand. How could a woman he had described as a stray pup outsmart his entire security detail? How could the person he mocked as pathetic have the backbone to leave behind the only world she knew, and by doing so shatter his? Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Eliza Drago was learning that survival was less about endurance and more about transformation. She had arrived at the northern coast, a place of jagged cliffs and churning gray seas. She had traded her silk for a coarse, oversized wool sweater and a pair of heavy boots. She had taken a job at a local fish processing plant, a place where no one cared about your pedigree or your past, only your ability to work until your hands bled. Eliza walked toward the pier just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the water in shades of bruised purple and charcoal. She was exhausted, her shoulders aching from a 12-hour shift, but for the first time in her life she felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. She had no one to please, no one to wait for, and no one to mock her behind a mahogany door. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn notebook she had managed to snatch from the library before she left. It wasn't full of secrets or bank codes. It was full of her own thoughts, the things she had been too afraid to say to Julian. She sat on a wooden crate and began to write, documenting the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. Suddenly, a black sedan, a sleek, out-of-place machine in this land of rusted trucks and fishing boats, turned the corner and slowed to a crawl. Eliza's heart stopped. She didn't need to see the license plate to know who was inside. The sight of that car felt like a physical weight pressing the air from her lungs. Julian Corleone stepped out. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than the entire pier, looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of salt, rust, and survival. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp and desperate, until they landed on her. He froze. The man who had laughed, the man who had been the architect of her misery, stood there looking completely undone. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if he were afraid she might evaporate if he didn't touch her. "Eliza?" he asked, his voice raw. Eliza didn't look away. She stood up, her jaw set, her hands calloused and stained with the work of her new life. She had expected to be afraid, but looking at him now, this man who had built his life on mocking others, she felt only a cold, sharp distance. "You're far from home, Julian," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't come here for a fight," he murmured, taking another step. "I came because I couldn't breathe, Eliza. I don't know what you did to this house or to me, but I can't stay there." "Then leave," Eliza said, gesturing to the vast, empty ocean behind her. "You have your wealth, your influence, and your friends. Go back to them. Laugh at someone else." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He didn't see the stray. He saw a woman who had survived him. And in that moment he realized with agonizing clarity that the regret burning in his chest was exactly what he deserved. The confrontation is here. Julian has found her, but he has no idea who she is anymore. Do you think Eliza should ever forgive him? Comment never, or maybe below. And if you're as hooked as I am, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the rising tension of the next act. The power dynamic has officially shifted. Julian stood on the edge of the pier, the wind whipping his dark hair across his eyes. He looked around at the rough men staring at them, at the cold, unforgiving sea, and then back at Eliza. He realized he had no power here. He was just a man standing in the cold, begging for a glance from the woman he had treated like a ghost. "I don't want to go back to them," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I want to know who you are. The girl I thought I knew. She never would have left. She never would have looked at me like that." Eliza looked at him, the man who had held her heart and thrown it away, and felt the final tether snap. "That girl died in your library, Julian," she said. "The woman standing in front of you? She's just getting started." She turned and began to walk away, leaving him standing alone on the pier as the fog began to swallow the coast. The air on the northern coast was a sharp contrast to the stifling, perfume-heavy atmosphere of the Corleone estate. It smelled of brine, engine oil, and raw, honest labor. Julian stood on the pier as if rooted to the spot, watching Eliza disappear into the evening fog. He wasn't accustomed to being ignored. His life was built on commanding presence and shifting the scales of power with a single word. Now he was just a man in a $3,000 suit standing in the mud, ignored by the only person whose opinion he had ever, secretly, craved. He didn't follow her immediately. Instead, he retreated to his car, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather steering wheel. He spent the night in a desolate motel, listening to the waves crash against the rocks, trying to reconcile the image of the timid, soft-spoken Eliza he had bullied with the fire-eyed woman who had just walked away from him. Eliza, meanwhile, didn't head to a warm bed. She walked until her boots were heavy with slush, finding solace in the biting wind. She was terrified, her heart hammered with every shadow, but for the first time she was terrified for herself, not of someone else. She spent the night in a shared bunkhouse with other seasonal workers, listening to their rough laughter and their stories of survival. It was a life of grit, and she found she was better at it than she ever was at being a decorative wife. The next morning the tension escalated. Julian didn't wait for an invitation. He showed up at the fish processing plant. He didn't come with guards or threats, which was perhaps the most jarring development of all. He came with a thermos of hot coffee and a quiet, patient posture that signaled he was out of his element. "I'm not here to take you back," Julian said, catching her as she emerged from the plant, her hair matted with salt, her apron stiff with fish scales. Eliza stopped. "Then why are you here, Julian? You've already lost the game. There's nothing left for you to win." "I think I've been playing the wrong game my entire life," he countered, his voice lacking the usual sharp, condescending edge. He looked at the workers milling around them, people who were tired, real, and unapologetic. He looked at his own manicured hands. "I lived in a world where everyone wanted something from me. I thought you were the same. I thought your loyalty was just a price you were willing to pay for the security I provided." Eliza looked at him, her eyes hard. "And the night in the library? Was that just part of the price too? Mocking my trust to entertain your friends?" Julian flinched, the regret finally surfacing as something raw and visible. "That was the loudest mistake of my life. It was a reflex, Eliza. I was so terrified of being vulnerable, of letting anyone see that I actually cared, that I did the only thing I knew how to do. I turned it into a joke. The tension between them was palpable, a live wire stretched across the pier. Other workers began to watch, their curiosity piqued by the out-of-place billionaire and the woman who had arrived with nothing but a broken look in her eyes. "You don't get to fix me, Julian," Eliza said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You broke me and I built myself back up one day at a time. The woman you're looking for doesn't exist anymore." He nodded slowly. "I know. But I'm not looking for her. I'm looking for the woman who walked out of my life without taking a single cent. That's the only person I've ever actually respected." He set the coffee on a wooden pallet and backed away, leaving her there. It was a tactical retreat, but it did nothing to settle the chaos in Eliza's mind. That evening she found a note tucked into the crate where she kept her meager belongings. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple map of the area with a single note in his elegant, arrogant handwriting. "The tides are coming in harder tomorrow. The harbor is dangerous. Be careful." It was a small gesture, but it sent a shockwave of confusion through her. Was he trying to manipulate her again, or was the man beneath the monster finally starting to emerge? She felt the old pull, the desire to trust, to comfort, to be the thread that fixed his knot. But she stopped herself. She burned the note in the small stove of the bunkhouse, watching the ink curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. She was finished being the fixer. But the tension remained, a persistent hum in her brain. What would he do next, and how much longer could she keep her distance? The tension is reaching a breaking point. Julian is changing his tactics and Eliza is fighting to keep her walls up. Do you think his change of heart is genuine, or just a new way to pull her back into his trap? Comment real or trap below. And make sure to subscribe. The midpoint of this story is approaching, and the reveal is going to change everything. As the night grew colder, the sirens began to wail. The harbor tide, as Julian had warned, was rising with a vengeance, threatening to swallow the docks whole. Eliza grabbed her coat and rushed toward the water to help secure the equipment, not knowing that in the chaos of the storm, she was about to face the ultimate test of her new independence. The storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a physical manifestation of the chaos that had followed Julian to the coast. The wind screamed through the pilings of the pier, and the ocean surged, turning the harbor into a churning black maw. Eliza, fueled by a terrifying surge of adrenaline, fought to pull the heavy ropes securing the fleet. Her hands, calloused from weeks of hard labor, bled, but she didn't stop. She wasn't doing it for Julian, and she wasn't doing it for the company. She was doing it because this was her harbor now. Suddenly, a massive swell hit the pier, snapping the main tether and sending a heavy crane housing careening toward the walkway. Eliza was pinned. A metal strut crushed her foot, trapping her against the splintering wood. The ocean roared, inches from dragging her into the deep. "Eliza!" Through the spray she saw him. Julian wasn't wearing his suit. He was in torn slacks and a rain-slicked jacket, clawing his way across the debris-strewn dock. He didn't care about the risk. He lunged into the freezing water to reach her. He pulled at the beam, his face contorted in a way she had never seen before. Not arrogance, not mockery, but raw, primal fear. Fear of losing her. He shoved his shoulder against the metal, his muscles straining, his own skin tearing as he fought to lift the weight. "Julian, stop," she gasped, the pain in her foot white-hot. "You'll break your back." "I don't care," he shouted back over the roar of the gale. "I broke everything else. I'm not letting this go." With a roar of effort that sounded like a man exorcising his own demons, he heaved the beam just enough for her to drag herself free. He scooped her up, not as an ornament but as a lifeline, and carried her through the surging water to the safety of the processing plant's warehouse. They collapsed on the cold concrete floor, both gasping for air, drenched and shivering. The storm raged outside, but inside the silence was different. It was the silence of a truth that could no longer be hidden. "Why?" Eliza whispered, her voice shaking as she looked at his bleeding shoulder. "Why are you doing this? You're the man who bought everyone. You don't know how to sacrifice." Julian leaned his head back against a steel pillar, his chest heaving. "My father, Elias Corleone. He didn't raise me, Eliza. He broke me. He taught me that everyone has a price, and if you don't set yours high enough, you'll be the one being sold. That night in the library, my friends were testing me. They were betting on whether I'd tame you or get bored of you. I chose to laugh because I was terrified that if I admitted I loved you, I'd be giving them the only weapon they needed to destroy me. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a grief that spanned decades. I became the monster so I wouldn't have to be the prey. I mocked you because I couldn't understand how someone could be so pure, so inherently good without trying to manipulate anyone. Scared me. It still scares me. The revelation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Eliza realized then that Julian wasn't just a villain in her story. He was a man who had been a prisoner of his own upbringing, trapped in a cycle of cynicism he didn't know how to break. You didn't have to treat me like a joke, Julian, she said softly, reaching out to touch the blood on his shoulder. I was the only one in that room who didn't want anything from you. I know, he choked out. That's why I have to spend the rest of my life making sure you never see me as that man again. He stood up, his legs steadying, and looked at the door. Outside, the storm was beginning to break, the first hints of a pale, morning light creeping through the clouds. I have the resources to rebuild this harbor, he said, his voice regaining its calm, steady authority. Not because I want to own it, but because I want to give you back what the storm took. And then, I'll go. I won't come back until you tell me you're ready to hear the rest. Eliza looked at him. The man who had mocked her, the man who had just saved her life, and the man who was finally, painfully learning to be human. The dynamic had shifted permanently. He was no longer trying to own her. He was waiting to be worthy of her. The truth is finally out. Julian's past explains his cruelty, but does it excuse it? Comment excused, or unforgivable below. And please subscribe to see if Julian can truly change his ways, or if some people are too broken to be put back together. We're deep into the emotional climax now. As the sun rose over the battered, scarred harbor, Eliza stood on the deck watching Julian's car pull away. She knew she wasn't the same girl who had run away from the mansion. And for the first time she wondered if the man driving away wasn't the same man who had arrived. The storm had passed, but the aftermath left the harbor in shambles. Eliza stood on the docks, staring at the destruction. The splintered wood, the tangled nets, the chaos of a life she had only just started to build being stripped away. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the news that hit her like a cold wave. The Corleone Empire was fracturing. While Julian had been obsessing over the stray, who had left his gilded cage, his rivals had seen his absence as a sign of weakness. Vance Kincaid, first name from the Matrix, last name from the hitman's bodyguard. A brutal syndicate boss who had long awaited an opportunity to dismantle the Corleone legacy, had seized the shipping lanes. He didn't just want the territory, he wanted to eradicate anything that Julian valued. And he knew about Eliza. A black armored SUV arrived at the docks. Not Julian's sleek vehicle but a heavy utilitarian beast. Out stepped Vance, flanked by men whose cold, dead eyes mirrored the man Julian used to be. Vance didn't waste time on pleasantries. He walked up to Eliza, who was still nursing her injured foot, and loomed over her like a vulture. You're the little bird that caused the king to lose his mind, Vance sneered, his voice a gravelly rasp. They say he's losing sleep, losing money, and losing his grip because of a girl who sells fish. Eliza held her ground even as her heart hammered. He's nothing to me, she said, though the lie tasted like iron. Whether he is or isn't doesn't matter, Vance replied. To take Julian down, I don't need to kill him. I just need to break the only thing he's ever cared about. You're the collateral damage that's going to turn the Corleone Empire into a crater. Before she could move, Vance's men swarmed. Eliza was hauled into the back of the SUV, the doors slamming shut with a finality that shook the earth. She wasn't just abducted, she was being used as a pawn in a brutal war she hadn't signed up for. Miles away, Julian was meeting with his remaining loyalists when the news reached him. A video file had been uploaded to his private server. He watched, his face turning an ash gray, as Vance Kincaid looked directly into the camera from a remote warehouse on the edge of the city. If you want her back, Julian, Vance taunted, you'll sign over the Docklands. Every contract, every shipping manifest, every cent of revenue. If you don't, well, she's a weaver's daughter. I think she'd look much better as a memory. Julian's office, once a place of calculated power, now felt like a prison cell. He had the money to pay, but he knew Vance. Once he surrendered the docks, Vance wouldn't just take the empire, he'd execute them both. He was trapped in a classic dilemma. The power he had spent his life accumulating was now the very thing that was going to cost him the woman he finally understood. He looked at the desk where he had once mocked Eliza's trust. The irony was so bitter it made his throat ache. He had built a fortress of wealth to protect himself, only to find that he was completely, utterly powerless to save the one person who had dared to stand by him when he had nothing to offer but his own darkness. The empire he had built on cold-blooded pragmatism was collapsing, and the woman who had walked away was now the target of men who didn't know the meaning of mercy. He was alone, his authority stripped away, and for the first time he realized that if he chose his legacy he would lose his soul. If he chose Eliza he would lose his world. We've reached the darkest hour of our story. Julian is faced with an impossible choice. His legacy or the woman he loves. Do you think he should give up everything to save her, or is he destined to fail? Comment choose her, or choose power below. And make sure to subscribe. The turning point is coming and you won't want to miss how this collision of worlds ends. Julian closed his laptop. He didn't call his guards. He didn't call his lawyers. He reached into his desk, pulled out a heavy, forgotten revolver and checked the cylinder. He was going to walk into the lion's den, not as a king of the docks, but as a man with nothing left to lose. The warehouse was a cathedral of rusting steel and forgotten machinery, located on the edge of the industrial wasteland where the city met the sea. Julian Corleone didn't come with an army. He came with the quiet, terrifying focus of a man who had already calculated the cost of his own life. He had discarded his suit for something dark and utilitarian, his movements precise as he bypassed the outer perimeter of Vance Kincaid's stronghold. Inside the belly of the warehouse, Eliza Drago was tied to a chair in the center of a makeshift ring of containers. Vance paced around her, his hand resting on the grip of a sidearm. He was waiting for the surrender, expecting the great Corleone to walk through the front doors, hands raised, begging to trade his empire for her life. But Vance didn't know the layout of the old docks as well as Julian did. He didn't know about the ventilation shafts that connected to the main floor, or the fact that the entire building was supported by the same pylons Julian's own construction team had reinforced 3 years prior. Julian wasn't looking for a direct confrontation. He was looking for a distraction. He didn't walk through the front door. Instead he climbed to the high catwalks, his breath steady, his eyes locked onto the structural weak points of the central crane system. He pulled a small incendiary device from his pocket, not a weapon of war but a tool of industry, and placed it at the base of the crane's primary winch. He didn't just want to save Eliza. He wanted to pull the rug out from under Vance's entire operation. Where is he? Vance barked at his men, his patience fraying. He should have been here by now. Right here, Julian said, his voice echoing from the rafters. Vance spun around, eyes wide as Julian detonated the charge. The explosion wasn't massive. It was calculated. The crane's arm groaned and swung downward, smashing into the containers and creating a wall of debris that cut Vance's men off from the center of the floor. In the confusion, the darkness of the warehouse became an ally. Eliza, hearing the crash, didn't panic. She had spent the last 2 months working on the docks. She knew the physics of a tether. She began to rock the chair, using the vibration of the falling debris to catch a jagged edge of a metal shard on the floor. Her wrists were raw, her skin torn, but she didn't stop. She felt the rope give, the friction burning until finally, snap. She was free. She didn't run for the exit. She picked up a heavy wrench from the floor, her heart pounding with a fierce, crystalline clarity. She had been a weaver, a stray and a victim, but today she was a survivor. Julian dropped from the rafters, landing silently behind the last guard who was aiming toward Eliza. One swift, precise strike and the guard was down. He turned to face his cousin's rival, Vance Kincaid, who now stood alone, his weapon shaking. "It's over, Vance," Julian said, his voice cold, devoid of the arrogance he used to wear like armor. "You wanted the docks. They're yours. But you'll have to dig them out of the rubble first." "You're a fool," Vance sneered. "You've ruined yourself for a girl who doesn't even want you." Julian didn't look at Vance. He looked at Eliza. She was standing 10 feet away, blood on her wrists, holding a wrench like a weapon, her eyes burning with a defiance he had never seen in anyone, let alone the stray he had once mocked. He didn't see a pawn. He saw a partner. "I'm not ruin," Julian said, taking a step toward her. "I'm an evolution." The realization dawned on Vance. He wasn't fighting a man obsessed with money or power anymore. He was fighting a man who had finally found something worth dying for. And that made him the most dangerous person in the room. The momentum has shifted. Julian and Eliza are finally fighting on the same side, and Vance Kincaid is backed into a corner. If you're cheering for their reunion, smash that like button. We're heading into the final confrontation. Do you think they'll escape this alive? Comment escape below. And make sure to subscribe. The climactic resolution is coming next, and you won't want to miss the payoff. As the warehouse began to tremble from the structural collapse, Julian and Eliza moved in perfect sync, a silent, lethal team forged in the fires of regret and rebirth. The empire was falling, but as they sprinted toward the light of the bay, they both knew they were finally standing on solid ground. The warehouse was groaning, the sound of tearing metal and buckling steel filling the air as the structural supports began to fail. Vance Kincaid was scrambling toward the rear exit, his bravado gone, replaced by the desperate clawing instinct of a cornered rat. He didn't care about the docks, the empire, or the power anymore. He only cared about survival. But Eliza didn't let him leave. She moved with a fluidity born of months of relentless, grueling labor. She didn't rely on brute strength, she relied on the environment. She swung the heavy industrial wrench, not at Vance, but at the control panel of the high-tension cable system that ran along the ceiling. Sparks showered the room and a massive steel tether snapped, whipping through the air like a serpentine lash. It caught the heavy iron door Vance was reaching for, slamming it shut and locking it in place with a sound like a thunderclap. "You think you're in control?" Vance screamed, turning to face them, his pistol raised. "I'll bury you both under the weight of this empire." Julian didn't hesitate. He wasn't the man who once relied on security guards and contracts to enforce his will. He lunged, closing the distance between him and Vance with a speed that startled even the syndicate boss. He wasn't fighting for the docks, he was fighting to remove the last obstacle between him and the woman who had taught him how to be real. Vance fired, the muzzle flash lighting up the gloom. The bullet grazed Julian's side, but the impact only drove him harder. He tackled Vance into a pile of shipping crates, the sound of splintering wood and rhythmic heavy punches echoing through the rafters. It wasn't elegant. It was raw, desperate, and fueled by the realization that his life of influence had been a slow death, while this struggle was the first moment he had felt truly alive. Eliza watched, her heart in her throat, until she saw Vance's weapon skitter across the floor. She scooped it up, but she didn't point it at him. She pointed it at the ceiling, firing a single shot into the emergency release lever of the main hydraulic gates. The bay doors groaned and swung wide, revealing the blinding pale gray light of the rising tide. The sea rushed in, not enough to drown them but enough to flood the floor and make it impossible for anyone to find their footing. "Julian now!" Eliza shouted. Julian shoved Vance aside, pinning him against a load-bearing column with a chokehold that left no room for escape. "Look at it, Vance," Julian growled, gesturing to the harbor. "The empire is gone. There's nothing left to rule. You lost because you couldn't imagine a world where you weren't the biggest shark in the tank." He shoved Vance into the freezing, rising water, letting the weight of his own hubris drag him down toward the security teams waiting outside. Julian turned back to Eliza. They were both covered in soot, oil, and seawater. They stood in the center of the ruin, the silence of the storm returning as the warehouse around them settled into its final, permanent resting place. He walked toward her, his breath ragged, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of something, anger, regret, or maybe, just maybe, a second chance. "I lost the empire," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper above the sound of the waves. "I have no home to take you back to. I have nothing left to give you." Eliza looked at him, the man who had just risked his life not for his legacy but for her. She reached out, her hands dirty and scarred, and touched his face. "You have exactly what you need," she said. "You have the truth. And for the first time, you have someone who actually knows who you are." He didn't pull her into a cinematic embrace. He simply held her hand, his thumb brushing over the rough skin of her palm. The threat was gone. The weight of the Corleone name, the name he had used to hide his fear, was buried under 1,000 tons of steel. They were finally, truly nobody. And that was the most powerful thing they had ever been. The battle is won, but the future is wide open. Julian and Eliza have escaped the wreckage, but what does life look like for two people who have burned down their own world? Comment, freedom, if you love this resolution. We have one final part left to wrap up this emotional journey, the satisfying conclusion of our story. You definitely don't want to miss how they choose to start over. Subscribe if you haven't yet, and let's bring this home. As the authorities arrived, surrounding the bay in a flurry of lights and sirens, they didn't find a billionaire and his prize. They found two people walking hand in hand toward the horizon, leaving the wreckage behind, neither looking back. The city lights were a flickering, distant memory, reduced to a hazy glow on the horizon that felt like the lights of a theater production Eliza Drago had finally exited. The northern coast had given way to a quieter, more honest geography. A small, wind-swept town where the houses were painted in muted tones and the people measured time by the tides rather than the ticker tape of the stock exchange. 6 months had passed. The warehouse was a skeletal monument to the past, and the Corleone name had dissolved into the archives of legal history. Julian Corleone was no longer the man in the $1,000 suit. He was wearing heavy canvas work pants, his hands calloused from hauling nets and repairing the aging hulls of local fishing vessels. The arrogance that had once fueled his every move had been sanded away by the relentless work and the salt air, replaced by a quiet, deliberate humility. Eliza walked down the wooden pier, the morning sun warming the back of her neck. She was carrying a basket of supplies, fresh bread, local fruit, and the tools for the weaving business she had slowly built from the ground up. She wasn't an ornament anymore. She was a business owner, a respected member of a community that didn't care about her pedigree, only her talent and her integrity. She found him on the deck of the Northern Star, a boat they had spent weeks restoring together. Julian stood at the helm, checking the rigging, his movements natural and unhurried. When he saw her, the transformation in his expression was absolute. A softening, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "The tide is turning," he said, his voice stripped of its former coldness. "We can make the crossing if we leave within the hour." "Then let's go," Eliza said, stepping onto the deck. They didn't have the mansion, the security detail, or the hollow influence of the Docklands. They had a boat, a future they were building with their own hands, and a bond that had been forged not by convenience, but by the fire of their mutual destruction and rebirth. They anchored in a secluded cove, the water so clear it looked like liquid glass. As the sun began its slow descent, Julian sat beside her on the small bench, his hand finding hers. It wasn't the possessive, demanding grip of the man he used to be. It was the steady, grounding presence of someone who finally understood the true weight of the life he had been given. "I still look back sometimes," Julian confessed, his gaze fixed on the quiet ripples of the water. "I think about the man I was and I feel a shiver of genuine horror. I wasted so much time, Eliza. I wasted so much of us." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, rhythmic thump of his heart. A heart that was finally, truly his own. "We didn't waste it, Julian. We were just learning the cost of our own freedom. We aren't that man and woman anymore. We're just us." "That's enough for me," he said. They spent the evening planning the next phase of their life, not a life of power but of purpose. They talked about the people they had met, the work they had done, and the peace they had found in the simple act of existing without performance. The silence that had once haunted Julian's grand estate was now a companion they cherished. A space filled with shared memories and the promise of a future that was theirs to define. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in the soft, glowing hues of twilight. The past was buried beneath the waves, and the future was a vast, open expanse of calm water. They had lost the empire, but in the ruins, they had discovered something far more valuable. A life that was earned day by day and a love that was chosen moment by moment. It was, in every sense, the beginning. We have reached the end of their journey and I hope you felt every beat of it. Eliza and Julian proved that you can lose everything and still end up with more than you ever had. It has been such an honor to tell this story with you. If you loved this emotional conclusion, smash that like button one last time. And if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next big 40-minute epic. We're just getting started on this journey, and your support is what makes it all possible. What kind of story do you want to see next? Something high-stakes and action-packed? A deep, psychological thriller? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching and keep believing in the power of starting over.